Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, it's Mike and Davina here, and thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Today's episode, we've got none other than Jamie King. Now, if you're not familiar with Jamie has done some amazing work in the prog-metal genre. He's worked with bands like Between the Buried and Me, The Contortionist, and so many more. And inside of this interview, we get into some really cool conversation about his personal approach to working in the prog genre. Prog is a very different ballgame than working on most rock music or pop music, and it's often very complicated. There's a lot of musicality and technical parts and lots of layers, and Jamie has a really interesting approach to how he works on arrangements and getting tones, and inside of this episode, we get real deep into that, and he has some really cool perspective on how to approach working with these musicians and with the genre, and so that you can get the best sound. And we get into some really cool discussion about guitar tones. That's one of the things that I really love about Jamie's productions. He's got these amazing guitar tones. And inside of this episode, he gets real deep with discussing what his signal chain looks like when it comes to recording guitars and how he processes the sound. And he's got a really cool approach to getting the right tone for the right riff, which is pretty unique because a lot of people tend to talk about getting the right tone for the song, but Jamie's approach is for the riff. So it's really cool to get into that discussion and understand why he does this and what goes into the decision-making process for him. So inside of this episode, I know you're going to find a lot of great stuff, especially when it comes to recording guitars. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just jump right into the interview. Jamie, thank you for being on the Master Mix podcast. How you doing?
Doing good, man. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. For people who might not be familiar with your background, can you give us a little bit of story on how you got into this industry and ultimately where you are today?
Well, I mean, of course, as many engineers, I started with music as, a performer. I decided I wanted to play drums at a young age and watching my dad and uncle play. And, I had bands doing thrash metal and progressive, metal and all throughout high school. And, I had started recording on a 4-track just to capture ideas and things of that nature. And I kind of noticed, I felt like I had a knack for getting decent sounds, even with a 4-track. We had like a PA mixer and some stuff for live sound, some outboard gear for live sound. And I would set the band up through that and mic everything up and we'd record the whole band to one track. And it was funny because, I felt like the tones that I was getting like that was actually better than some of the professional demos that other bands in the local area were getting with real studios. And, I think it's mainly just because I understood, the types of sounds, the style of music that we were doing in other local bands. I understood those sounds. And most of the, back then studio equipment was really expensive and, only the older, generations could afford that stuff. And they didn't understand, the emerging thrash metal and, the progressive metal styles of music of the time. And they didn't really even like this type of sounds that we wanted. So they wouldn't give them to us, And but I was able to get that with a 4-track. And I started with 4 tracks and eventually upgraded to some ADATs, I think around 1997, which are digital audio drives for those who might not know. But that was an upgrade in quality, obviously, from a 4-track cassette recorder. I could actually get, pretty professional sound that way. And, obviously the first BT Bam record was recorded on ADATs and, my band Swift's first records were recorded on ADATs and things of that nature or whatever. But yeah, that's kind of how I got started. It was kind of out of necessity, honestly. Like, we had with the bands in the high school, I had gone to, large format studios, even, started in some basement studios and local, smaller studios, but then, weren't getting the sound qualities that we were looking for. And, so we eventually, went to a $90 an hour large format studio, and spent like $15,000 on an EP and it still wasn't good. Still they didn't give us the tones we were going for. And it was like, at that point, this is, I guess, 1996, 97, I would decided it's like, well, I can't afford to spend more than this. Unless the band gets signed, like it's not going to happen. So I guess I'm just going to have to figure this out myself. So I just decided instead of spending more money to record with people, I would just figure it out, buy the gear and figure things out myself. And, I recorded my band's first album. And then I guess the Between the Buried to Me guys heard that record when they were in Prayer for Cleansing. And, and amongst other bands, a local band called Beloved, another great local, Christian hardcore act. But yeah, they heard our recordings and they, asked me to record them. And at that time I was working out in my parents' basement, it's just a basement with concrete walls and tools hanging up and exposed insulation. And, the room actually strangely sounded good. It had odd angles and the insulation, worked as diffusion and stuff of that nature. So that actually the recordings were actually quite decent. I'm doing a lot of remixing right now of the old records and, a lot of 20th anniversary plus type things going on. And, I was surprised at how good the raw tones were. I didn't have the equipment and the knowledge to get the mixes and production the way I wanted. But, the tones were actually solid, with really inexpensive budget gear. And, that kind of all ties into what's going on now, with, everybody can record at home, in essence, that's what I was doing even back then. It was one of the early guys that was actually using budget gear and recording everything out of my parents' home. And, I was able to actually turn that into a career of sorts. And, but yeah, that's how I got started. Obviously I saw the need to get into Pro Tools so I can do the production editing, things of that nature, doing more advanced mixing and, stuff like that. And, and here I am just 20 some years later, I guess I've been doing this for a living since 2001. So, approaching 20 years, doing it for a living.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's kind of, I feel like your story is very similar to a lot of people where it's, that necessity feeling of, we just spent so much money at this big studio and the results are still horrible. And there's a couple of things that I got out of what you just said where, there just, again, this kind of re-emphasizes that fact that like, it's not about the gear that you're working with, right? Like, you can have that $1 million facility and have a person who doesn't know how to drive the ship and, it still sounds like shit. Versus now you can have all this great affordable gear and probably get much better results, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you really don't need much at all anymore. You get like, an inexpensive interface, I guess acoustic drums, is still kind of, I guess, it was this one of those things you can throw some money at it and it's going to sound more like you're accustomed to hearing, if you do, put some money at it, the proper mics and some good preamps and things like that. But everything else, honestly, I mean, you can almost do anything with an inexpensive preamp and a couple mics and a laptop,
Definitely.
And, obviously a lot of people sidestep the drum thing with programming drums. I'm not I'm not a huge fan. I understand the convenience and, the writing benefits from using program drums and things of that nature. But then, now, I mean, if you're really good at the programming, you can get a very convincing sounding, program drum sound. They're real samples and things like that done with real gear and things. And so if you know what you're doing, you have good programs and good samples and that thing, stuff of that nature, you can get a really just convincing and usable program drum sound, and then just not have to, pay to record real drums in a studio or set your own studio up to record real drums.
For sure. And as a drummer, I imagine that you would, you can identify those little nuances that, the singers or the guitar players can't necessarily pick out in the program drums, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It drives me insane. Yeah. I mean, and, like I said, there's some people doing a good job with it, but I can, it's just something about the hi-hats and the rides and things. It just, it's, and a lot of times people program, they're not necessarily drummers or they don't end up programming them drummerly. It's like, okay, that's 5 things being hit at one time. That's physically impossible. And, and they just somehow it slips through and, stuff like that, but, my main gripe about it is, if you're going to use program drums, just go ahead and use electronic sounds and, different sounds and stuff. Like, don't try to make it sound like a real kit, my thing is like, if you want a real kit, then use a real kit. And, there's something about the, a drummer's, the imperfection of a drummer, like the dynamics and the tempo fluctuations and subdivision fluctuations, things like that makes real drums like it, there's subtle things that people do even when they're not consciously thinking about it that really adds to the song oftentimes, makes a moment more explosive. They might, play a chorus and just really, slow it down a little bit or speed it up a little bit or, make it hit so much harder. So there's little nuances like that I think the average listener, they can't, they wouldn't be able to articulate, but they can feel it,
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of bands are selling themselves short by going the all programmed route, all the time. But having said that, if you're going for a really mechanical vibe and you want a machinish type sound, then oftentimes the programmed drums are the way to go. Obviously you can get precision that you can't accomplish with a real drummer. So I guess it just depends on the aesthetic, and the desired overall production value you're going for in your stuff. And, but yeah, I think, it's not, there's just some artists, this would obviously be better with real drums, and I hear, and they, there's obviously an expense element, and time and skill element involved in producing drums, real acoustic drums. But I guess that's what we're here for. Hopefully, we can steer people in the right direction, and there's resources out there so you can learn these skills and things like that. And, use your drums to, program drums to write and come up with the ideas and stuff and, demo and things of that nature. But, for your real record, either get in with a studio that has the setup and, hire you a session guy or, find a guy who will do it. There's tons of amazing drummers out there. You just got to call on them,
Yeah, definitely. Another thing you had mentioned earlier that I thought was really interesting, and it's something that I've also experienced with when I listen to my old recordings too, is that, you had mentioned you listen back to those old recordings and like you got great tones, even though you didn't really know, like you didn't have the gear or like what you thought you needed, but you were still able to get those right tones. And it's something that I find is like, it's really interesting to look back at those old recordings because it's almost like that, the fact that you don't know anything makes you just figure it out and get those tones as opposed to like thinking, well, I need this piece of equipment and then I need to do this and gain stage it this way or mic it this way or whatever. Like, I think as you get older, sometimes you learn these like so-called rules of how to properly record things that it kind of that can sometimes get in the way of like the real vision of like, am I getting the right tone? And I'm curious to get your take on that when you listen back to those old recordings, if you feel the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, I think, many people go through this, when you start out, you like, hey, I like this recording. I want to learn how to make things sound this way. And like my whole goal was to, and when I started, there was no YouTube, there were no podcasts. I had to just read books, talk to people who recorded with my favorite producers and engineers. And a lot of those guys, they were guarded industry secrets, things like reamping, it's been done since the 70s and they just didn't teach, you couldn't go to school to learn that. They were like keeping it secret. Subwoof, like sub mics for kick drums, reverse wired speakers and things. They're like, oh, these are secrets. I'm not telling anybody how I got our sounds. Now all that's the cat's out of the bag. Of course, you can get all this information. But when I was first starting, I was having to experiment to try to figure out my own way of getting those sounds. And and I now that I'm older, I'll go back and listen to sounds and like. I've gone back over the years and listened to things, and I'm like, what? The way I used to do stuff with. It might be actually better, it's like, it was more unique for one, because, as you develop as a producer, as an engineer, I think there's a value in having a sound, that's unique, especially now, it's like to cut through the clutter. You have, your Kempers and all your drum programs and your plugins and things. So it's really easy for everything to start sounding the same in metal and rock and stuff like that. You could literally have the exact tone that this band used and stuff of that nature. Back then it was, with miking a real amp and all the different amps and, with tubes and their variations of, where they are in the burn cycle and things of that nature all affected the sound. And, there's almost, inherent just by default, you're going to get something kind of different and unique just because you didn't know what everybody else was doing. You weren't using the exact same gear that everybody else was using. There was like this. So I think in some ways it was better for creativity, for uniqueness, and and all that helped bands that cut through the clutter. A lot of times, nowadays it's really hard to get noticed as a band, and the instinct is like, hey, this band is successful. They sound like this, so we should sound like that also. I think on the surface that seems like a logical conclusion to draw, but in the end, like true success, that might help at first, get attention from that band's fans. But if you want true success, ultimately you have to be an exclusive product, and how you record, the tones you use, and all that stuff. If you can find something that's actually good and that resonates and that works for the material that you're doing, and to create a sound, I really think that ultimately will help the artist succeed more so, and then which helps you as an engineer, as a producer, succeed as well, to help these people achieve this sound, this exclusive sound. It helps you cut through the clutter. I mean, there's so many bands, there's so much content online nowadays. I think it's probably more important now than it even was then,
And it's funny too, because, what's out right now and what's hot right now by industry standards, like that stuff was recorded typically like a year ago, or in some cases more too, right? So
absolutely,
what's being recorded right now is going to be the new big thing in a year from now. So to try to play that game of catch up is impossible.
Yeah, I just don't think it's wise. The older I get, the more I realize that it was never a wise thing. I mean, I think it's a good thing to learn. Like, okay, how's everybody doing this? And to be able to get like industry standard sounds, sounds that are, because, you want to make the client happy. And oftentimes, I've experienced with mixing and mastering and things like that, people, they want their stuff to sound like something else, and you have to be able to do that, with a lot of clients. I try to, let things sound the way they sound naturally, personally, just like, hey, let me take the tones that you have brought in to record. Let me take the tones that you sent for mix. Let me take the stuff you've mastered. I'm going to do like just broad strokes with this stuff. And let's see if it sounds good. See if you like it. And then, let it sound the way it sounds. That way, hopefully there's a chance of it being different and original, instead of trying to force it into some, mold, some preconceived notion of what it should sound like and things of that nature. And, but obviously some clients are like, hey, we still don't like it. We want it to sound exactly like Periphery or whoever. And luckily nowadays it's virtually possible. You can grab the Nolly, get good sounds, and you can get the, the Axe Effects or the plug-in, the amp that he used, whatever, it's pretty, if the guys can play like the guys in Periphery, which is probably not the case, but if they can, then you can get a pretty close sound. And, to make a living, as a producer or whatever, that's important. But I would say to those at home, trying to craft something, I would say just, don't worry about that too much, just from experience and wisdom and watching other bands. And, the bands that I've worked with that are successful have a unique, sound. You hear 30 seconds of them and you know who they are by their vocal tone, by their guitar riff choices, by the amp tones, by the drum sounds, overall production, things like that. And I think I'm pretty sure that's part of why they are as successful as they are. And, so, I'd say just spend more time on the art, not this whole, the details of all the recording and all this stuff, if it's, having said that, it's got to sound good. There's obviously some people, they're fine with stuff that doesn't really quite sound good enough, stuff out of tune, out of, off time, too much can really turn people off. I think that's, since the alternative day, there was a time when you could be really loose, really out of tune, really off time, and it was kind of cool, but, we're definitely not we're definitely not there at this current time with most listeners. And, and rock and metal specifically has a hard enough time, with, appealing to the masses as it is. So there's a certain production value that needs to be there. But like I said, it doesn't have to be as specific. It doesn't have to match what someone else is doing and, things like that. It just needs to be good, but unique, I think, is more of an important quality than generic.
For sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier. Like you still have to know how to achieve those results. If someone comes to you and says, I want this sound, you still need to know. And, whether you think that is the ultimate sound the band should have, like, that's just another tool that you now know how to do, right? And like you can implement it and, integrate it however you see fit to make it work for the style of music you're working on. It's funny, like when you think about, like, I think a lot of rock music is kind of derived from pop music in a way, and pop production, like, the tightness and like the samples and all that kind of stuff. Like that was stuff that was being used forever ago. And it took a while. Like the rock guys wanted to be the edgy guys and do something a little different. And then like all of a sudden, you get a guy like Bob Rock or whoever who's like adding samples to his mixes, and everyone's like, whoa, like what is that? Like how do we get that right? And like now the metal world, the rock world, like everything's super tight. It's sampled, it's tuned. It's like, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean it works for different. I think the sweet spot is somewhere in between. I think there's a point where in the past things have gone too far. And I found myself, I've got some OCD tendencies, and early on I found myself, quantizing too much, tuning too much. I was really like, because I just, the OCD makes me want to make everything as perfect as it can be, technically. And then, I realized pretty soon I'm like, this isn't the way to go. This is actually taken away from the music when you step back and you come back and listen to the music later, and you're like, this is really sterile sounding. And a lot of, old schoolers from my generation, we feel like, a lot of the new bands, they're technically better as far as players and all this stuff, but why is the music not better? Why is this like, it doesn't resonate or stick with us more? Even though it sounds better, it's like the old stuff, it doesn't really sound that good. It just, something was more impactful about it. Maybe it was because we were younger then. That could very well possibly be a big component of that. But I think a lot of it, it's like I said, it's just, they strip the life out of it, strip the humanity away from it. And it's like, and even though they're instruments, there's still a performance element, more so of a performance element in the old stuff than there is in the modern stuff. But, like I said, you can do things that don't necessarily, you completely take the performance element out. Like you just mentioned, you can blend samples. You can do some, production things that kind of, give the bigger sound, the wow factor, the more, more articulation, things of that nature, without completely stripping of its humanity. I mean, there's an art form in there,
Absolutely.
And it's, some people have it naturally, that notion of what, how much how much of a processed sound you should use. And some people, go overboard with that. And, they have artists that may never achieve success because there's, it doesn't resonate with people for whatever reason.
Absolutely.
But yeah, like I said, it kind of takes experimentation, and it's different. Like I said, it's different for different genres, different specific. It depends on the aesthetic you're going for. And, so the super raw sound works for some artists, and the super produced sound works for some artists, and then just it depends on if you're working at home on your own stuff and recording other people, it's just finding the sounds and the production values that work for what you're going.
So then you do a lot of production rules as well. Like as a producer, how involved do you like to get in making those decisions on behalf of the band?
Well, it varies. It depends on the client, what they want. Oftentimes, most of the stuff I do is in the progressive realm these days. So most of the clients I have coming in, they pretty much come in with the basic idea of what they want. We're not making pop records, so there's no rules. It's just basically whatever sounds cool. And my personal approach is what I like to do is, let the band come in. If I'm recording the band or if I'm mixing the band, I just, like I mentioned earlier, is just take what they have, their ideas, try to incorporate everything. Let them try all that out first and see how it sounds. When I was younger, I was guilty of like jumping to conclusions about whether a part's good or not, or a tone is good or not. Too early, I'd be because oftentimes I would be like, I don't know if that bass line is going to work. That doesn't match the guitar at all. It's kind of taken away, type of thing. And then I found out later, oh, there's a keyboard part and the bass ties in with that and the guitar. Now I see, and I was guilty of making the argument too soon. So, so a lot of times I like, I come from the band. I come from that band that tried to hire a guy to record and express my vision, and they were unwilling or unable to do that. And it was frustrating. I spent lots of money. I literally was like, hey, man, can I get a good attack on the kick drum? We were fans of Metallica and Pantera and stuff like that. And they all had, a lot of, upper, high end attack or whatever in the kick drum. It's not normal for other styles of music. And, I'm paying $90 an hour, and you tell the guy, hey, we all want some attack on the kick drum. He was just like, no. And I'm like, what do you mean no? It's like, you take it out to paint your cards, like paint it red, and they're like, no, I'm going to paint it black. It's like, no, you're not. Like, and it blows my mind. So I still carry that anger and frustration to this day. So I put myself in their shoes. Like, I'm going to do what they want me to do, even if I don't like it at first. And then I will put, I'll give my opinion if it's not working. Luckily with the tools we have with Pro Tools and all the DAW recording situations, a lot of stuff is very reversible, very changeable. It can be, obviously, time consuming and, I guess, disheartening at times to have to change things,
Yeah.
But it's very possible. Back in the day, what you recorded is what you got, and, without having to re-record everything. But nowadays, like I said, you can record, make sure you record the direct guitar so you can reamp, change the guitar tone later. If what the client wanted is not, working, I could be like, hey, can we try a different guitar sound? It feels like it has too much gain, or, it just, or drum sounds and things of that nature. You can sample blend or swap out drum samples or EQ totally different. Like, I try to mic in such a way where we can, do more ambient type drum sound with room mics, or we can do more in your face dry drum sound. And, so there's a lot of flexibility. You can make these production decisions on the back end. And, I tend to do that. Like I said, most of my clients, they come in, they're not really looking for me to help them write their songs and things of that nature. I might have, if I feel like there's something that can add some drama to the mix, like in terms of production effects, or like adding a vocal harmony or, guitar harmony, or, a percussion instrument or a keyboard part or something. If I feel like, hey, this is thin, or this, could use, I try to always put myself in the listener's shoes. I try to be, because, when you're intimate with the music, when you're the writer and the music and stuff, you hear it all in a different way. It's like hearing your voice back. When you hear your voice in your head, it's different than when you record it and you hear it back. You're like, I sound like that, I honestly believe music is largely the same way. It's like, when you write it, even if you record it, it's like everything sounds different than you really sound. And I try to be that, try to put myself in the potential fans' mindset and try to hear it like they hear it. I'm not listening to the sweep. I'm not listening to the double bass or the crazy, thing that the band thinks is so cool. The average listener's not going to even know that that's difficult to play, or that's technically cool or whatever. They're going to listen to the overall. Does it have a good beat? Does it have a catchy melody? Can I relate to the lyrics? These things, and all that stuff has even a place and role in progressive styles of music and extreme styles of music as well. It's like, if somebody wants to listen to aggressive stuff, it probably should be pretty aggressive, so you don't want to come across weak. And, there's a lot of different aspects of music like that. So that's where my producer role is to try to, help the band steer them into a direction that for success with the public, and, and also while expressing wholly their intent as well. It's basically maximize everything about what they're trying to do.
Yeah, like I was curious about that too, because you work with a lot of prog metal bands, and that genre is known for being full of lots of technical instrumental elements, and people like showing off their talents a lot. And one of the challenges that a lot of producers face is finding that balance of serving the song versus serving the artist and their need to showcase their skills. So How do you strike that balance and determine when something's being overplayed versus serving the song?
Well, I mean, like I said, honestly, I'm more a fan of the overplayed stuff, because I know that people are listening to this, they're guitar players, they're drummers and stuff. I think honestly, it's a misstep if you're doing progressive styles of music and you're like not shredding. In my opinion, it's like, what market are you going for? Like, who's going to be listening to this? The guy, it's like if Dream Theater was like, hey, let's put out a record and we're not going to do any guitar solos. People would be like, what?
Let's all play power chords.
Yeah, exactly. I think most people would be fine if they just didn't have any singing vocals. They would probably be as big, if not bigger. I think, a lot of people get annoyed by the singing vocals, Dream Theater fans. But like I said, I mean, it's one of those things. So, and, the BT Bam guys and some of the other guys I've worked with will tell you the same thing. I really push the extreme stuff. I'm like, man, let's go crazy. Let's make this as interesting as possible, not chaotic, not in terms of like, there are some artists who they do too many layers and just too much stuff. And you can't really, even as someone who understands, has a decent working knowledge of theory and stuff like, if you can't really process what's going on relatively easily, I think you're going to be limiting yourself even to the progressive market. You can have moments like that, moments of chaos, but there's some artists who try to, their whole thing is chaos all the time, and it's like, I try to reason with those people and like point out like, hey, you might have too many layers and whatever, but like, let's take these crazy moments and let's, take a few of the layers out and let the coolest part shine more, like if I was producing a commercial band, of course I'd be like, you don't need these sweeping arpeggio solo for 2 minutes in the middle of a song. This is the average person who is going to listen to this does not care. Let's do just a good melody and cut the length and to 4 bars, whatever, 8 bars. And, if that was their goal, but, I'm almost never working with clients who have that goal of like, hey, we want to be, a commercial, successful, commercially successful artist in the traditional sense,
it's really kind of just catering to the genre and the history of the genre and what that typical sound is. Yeah.
I look at the markets, it just depends on what style of music is this stuff, in terms of, I think that's, important for me. I want to see the artists that I work with be successful. First and foremost to me, it's their, artistic expression. I want to make sure that's there. And then beyond that, especially when there's a label involved, I want to make sure that what the product they end up with is something is going to have maximum potential to, to appeal to the demographic that their music appeals to. And, and not, and like I said, I mean, like obviously, like I said, for instance, like a Metallica or something, I love Metallica, I grew up with Metallica, like I said, in retrospect, I love Black Album, but when it came out, it was like infuriating. Hey, these guys sold out. Bob Rock got with them. It's like, dude, you need a strong structure. You need to simplify. You need to, the prog-metal, thrash metal kid in me was like, what are you doing? This is, they got lucky in that Bob Rock was right. For the label, he steered them into a more marketable. He took the metal sound and distilled it down to something that was digestible for the average player. A lot of people are like, oh, Lars can't play, he just plays simple beats and blah, blah, blah. That's why they're the biggest metal band in the world. Because if he could shred blast beats and double bass, he would probably be doing it. And it would have held the band back because the average individual processed that as just like a barrage of noise, And because he plays these slamming grooves, then there's, exponentially more people who can process and enjoy that. And, like I said, that wouldn't have been my recommendation for them. I'm like, hey, you're hot off, Master Puppets and Justice for All. Like, let's take it up a notch, this is your demographic. So, I mean, but like I said, they were on Elektra. They're like, how do we get bigger? And then they looked at, AC/DC's selling way more records than we are. And why is that? Their stuff's simple, it's groovy, whatever. So they're like, let's go more in that direction. And for a business decision, it was correct, and they were obviously, I think that personally they were, ready to change it up anyway. I think they'd grown tired. It's kind of laborious to play technical music at a certain point, especially as you get older. It's more difficult. You have to think, more, you're on your toes the whole concert. If you're playing AC/DC, I can't imagine they're like worried about nailing their parts, they're like, they just go on stage and do it. And, but you're a prog band, you're a metal band, you're like, oh man, I hope I can do that double bass thing tonight. You stress yourself out, and it's,
but it's interesting too, because in the prog genre, there is that tendency to have like a band full of amazing players, and there's a lot of people fighting each other in some respects of like, the drummer is like, well, I got to play this crazy fill or this crazy beat, and the guitar solo is going to go on for like 5 minutes on top of this. And, we got to make this work. So, I imagine that your role as a producer has to be a little challenging in terms of like figuring out, okay, how do we find this blend that works, and taking like part of what the drummer is doing, part of the guitar player, and like, what's happening vocally or with the bass or whatever, like how do you put all those elements together and make them work and, get the band to agree to that, right?
Oh, it's absolutely a challenge. Yeah. And it's like, I've spent a lot of time, and there's tricks to make things work. And obviously there's, panning, and there's filtering, EQs, basically you got to find space in the mix, specifically. I usually, there's oftentimes where that happens, where you have, the guys singing the average individual is going to listen to the vocals first. The guitar is secondary for the average person. A guitar player, maybe not so much. He might be like, ignore the vocals. Let me listen to the solo or whatever. But, I get bands all the time who I think the arrangement's just poor in the fact that they're like, okay, we have a solo who obviously the guitar player wants it to be pronounced and clear and the focus, but then you got the dude singing the chorus over, like a chorus type of vocal that's also commanding attention too. A lot of times, I'll try to, if it's possible, I'll try to recommend a rearrangement. I'm like, hey, let's split these parts out, let's do the chorus. It's obviously you've got two things, but sometimes it's just not possible, especially later in the state, in the game, with real drums, things like that. You can't like just always change the structure of the song, whatever. But, usually I'll try to, like filter one or paint, okay, let's put the vocals in the middle and then we'll put the guitars out the side. That way they can both be loud and people can separate them in their minds maximally,
That's interesting to think about your arrangement that way too. And I think that that's something a lot of people forget about is like, you need to consider where things are going to be in the final product. And if you can record things in a way where you've kept panning in mind, then you can immediately build that separation and clarity just by, predetermining where things are going to be.
Yeah, I think a good composer, a good songwriter, whatever, in the progressive realm thinks in terms of that. It's, you get some of these bands who are like, hey, we're going to be a metal band with orchestral stuff. Some guys are great with it. And they know that guitars take up a lot of real estate sonically. There's a lot of mid frequencies that are just wiped out by loud, distorted guitars. There's some bands like, hey, we want to hear guitars loud and crunchy. And it's like, well, we're not going to be able to hear most of the strings then. So it's, which do you want to do? And that's one of probably the more difficult styles that I've found to work with. Unless the arrangement, if you've got a band who understands arrangement and they know like, okay, this is going to be guitar focal part. And on this part, we're going to let the orchestra be the foreground and we're going to write the parts. We're going to make a simple non-foreground guitar riff for this part where we're highlighting the orchestral stuff. And then when the guitar stuff's going on, we're going to simplify and have background type of orchestral stuff going on. So the texture stays there for both instruments, but the part itself is not commanding the attention. And that allows you to mix and it sounds fine. But yeah, you got, there's a lot of, particularly younger bands or whatever. A lot of times I'll get stuff for mix. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to mix this. I always try to make it work, but there's a band right now that I'm working with, a fantastic band from New York. Their stuff is amazing. But I think they just, I think they're all music school guys. They know theory and stuff like that. So what's challenging to listen to them is different than what's challenging to listen to for the average, even prog fan. And they have a lot of different layers, a lot of different things going on, and it sounds fine. They can process it because they know the inner workings of the song. They wrote them, they recorded them. So, and then even myself more so, I had gotten used to them, but I remember I was riding in a car with one of my guitar player friends, and I was kind of like, I just wanted to hear it on my car stereo to check the mix and stuff. And he was like, man, he's like, what is going on? Like, it's like the vocals is amazing. There's obviously there's a catchy, good vocal going on, but like, what is the guitar riff? Like, he's like, he was like, obviously upset by the fact that it sounded cluttered. He's like, he didn't understand it dawned on me. I was like, I need to mention this to the guys. They might want to try to strip some stuff out. Some less important parts, at least dial them way back in the mix. Cause obviously they want to hear everything clearly, but it's at the expense.
Yeah. There's only so much you can actually hear when everything's being played at once.
Yeah. I was like, you at least need to do radio mixes. Cause like you do a video promotion strategy or something where people are going to hear it for the first time. That's how they're going to hear it. They're going to hear it as pure chaos and they're going to be turned off and never listen to it again. Maybe on the record, you can have the more challenging one where, if you've got the fan already and then they can hear your original vision, but you could do maybe two versions. There's options of that like that. They've done radio versions forever. There's been, songs are like, we want the song to be 6 minutes. I'm like, okay, we need to trim it down to a 3-minute song for the radio because normal people and the radio guys, normal people don't want to hear a 6-minute long song and the radio guys don't want to play that long of a song. So we have to do that. But then the artist is like, this is my vision of the song. So, okay, we'll put it on the record, and so those compromises are, I think they work.
And I think it goes back to what you said earlier about the bands that you're working with and their vision or what their goals are, right? Like if it is a band that wants to be on the radio, the goals have to be different. Like, like for that band that wants to be on the radio, they can make those longer extended versions into like their live show, and make the live show more entertaining, but you need to focus on the recording and get the song, the foundational song there. Right. Whereas for a lot of prog bands, it is a little bit more drawn out, longer songs. The audience is used to that. So you have a little bit more room to play there.
Yeah, I think, but, it's like one thing, I tried, like I said, I always try to bring it back to, as my role of producer. Obviously, I'm here to provide a service and give a good mix and help them get the tones they want and things like that. But like I said, I try to look at the big picture of like the success of their product, how it reaches people and stuff of that nature. So, I really try to take their art. Like I said, I wish what somebody would do with some of my favorite bands. I'm like, man, as I want to see the band get bigger, I wish somebody would be like, do your crazy stuff, make it as crazy as possible, but let's do a marketable single. Like people wonder how, Dream Theater is one of the biggest progressive metal bands of all time. And they're like, how did they get so big and blah, blah, blah. There's bands who are there's musicians who are probably as good, if not better players than they are. But Dream Theater had Pull Me Under. They had a single, at one time, and they had major label push behind it. Rush, they were a huge, progressive band. They had some radio singles. Tool, they have crazy long drawn out songs, but they had some radio singles. It's like to reach the public and to cut through the clutter, traditionally. And I think even more so importantly today, it's like you need something that's instrumental in cutting through the clutter and to reach the average listener or the masses, or more so. If you have songs that are like, okay, I try to, if a song is crazy, it's like, okay, this is nowhere close to being a song that's going to be marketable or promote, to be used as a promotion item. Like, let's make this as crazy as possible. This will be your outlet for that. But hey, this song, if I notice the song has some marketing potential, I'm like, hey, let's at least do a radio or video version of this song, strip it down, maybe shorten it, whatever. I'll try to, take that opportunity to make that suggestion. And obviously, if a band doesn't have anything like that, then I'm like, well, you might want to consider that for your next record. Like, try to consciously, like, take your art, take your sound, and condense it. In a large part, between the Band and Me, they've had some crazy stuff. I think their last album, with in conjunction with their label, they were like, hey, your stuff is you're doing these 80-minute rolling records. It's kind of difficult to digest that, for the average person. Like, they suggested, obviously, monetarily it makes sense as well, of course, to split it into two records. But they're like, let's split it into two records. You'll have two digestible products or whatever. You can market it more easy. You can tour it, to do it, to perform it. They've been doing a lot of like perform the whole album type things just to play the record. You're playing for 80 straight minutes, in the last tour cycle, they could split it up so they could do the whole album and play some of their hits, the bigger, more popular songs. The marketing, there's a lot of little nuanced elements like that are huge. I still wish BT Band would do a radio single like that. It's just take their sound and distill it into a 3.5 minute long song with kind of almost predictable. I don't think they'll ever do it just because I think it's like against their, religion or
but
something.
That's exactly it though, right? Like the band that wants that commercial success, they have to be open to that, and they have to go into it thinking like, okay, well, maybe let's write some poppier stuff or like some catchier stuff that's shorter or whatever, right?
At least consider it. Yeah, at least consider it. You know what I'm saying? And that's, to me, I feel like it's my responsibility to be a voice of reason here. I'm from the old school, and I've seen the success. I mean, people are like, metal and rock, guitar-oriented music in general is not, considered pop anymore. And why is these things part of this is, like I said, I think metal's still huge. There's obviously, loads of people still love it. There's few bands who are still playing amphitheaters, Metallica and stuff. And but Metallica's still digestible, and a lot of these bands are like, they've gotten to the point where the stuff's just not even digestible for the average individual. They don't have anything for the average individual to digest. And, and it's just one of those things where, I think that's it kind of led to the state we are in now, where there's no guitar or any music on the radio. You know, I mean, obviously, I think mainly it's the record labels aren't supporting it, or they have the note. They've decided that they don't want it to be the predominant style of music and stuff. But
it's kind of one of those funny things where you see it in different genres, where bands. Typically, like a band's first record has a very specific sound that defines them, right? And in the prog genre, it's usually a very technical sounding record. And then, as their career goes on, you find the bands that kind of simplify their sound. And then in the like pop world or whatever, it's like they start super, super simple. And then it's like they get bored of that stuff. So they're like, I'm actually a pretty good player. Like I want to show off a little bit more of my talent. And like you kind of see that they start to break off that way, right? It's kind of funny to see those two different dynamics and how they play between genres.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it happens. It happens as an engineer and producer and stuff. But as you get older, you start to realize that's kind of a mistake. Like like I said, I personally, I'm a fan of music. I personally don't care anymore. It's gotten to the point. There's so many kids. There's a Chinese 8-year-old girl who will shred your face off on guitar. It's like, at this point, it's like, what is the point in like trying to sweep arpeggios and do all this crazy difficult stuff? Like, does anybody really care anymore? Like, especially, there's probably somebody better than you out there. To me, it's more important what you come up with, the creative aspect of it, and and how it feels, how it makes somebody feel, and things like that. I think that's more valuable, certainly to the average listener, but even to the musician, even just to the prog fan of like myself. I like progressive stuff, but it has to be good too. It can't just be crazy. And I think when you're younger, you think you're impressing people and you want to impress people and get those accolades and stuff. But once you get older, you don't value that as much anymore. And you realize that, hey man, this is, it's like with BT Bam, Paul, he's like, dude, what I like about guitar, I realize are just the riffs. I just want to riff. I just want to play some riffs, and, I think he's looking at, going on tour with the Tosin and the Animals Leaders and all these places. Like, man, I don't feel like practicing to be able to play all this stuff. It's like, you probably could, but it's going to take, hours and hours and hours of your life to be able to do that. And nobody ultimately cares. It's like, a few people, but the masses would still rather just hear a good song or feel a good song that resonates with them, whether it be the groove and melody or the combination. So
in your opinion, then, like, what makes a great song?
That's a really hard one. You know what I'm saying? I mean, obviously, I still think, the most powerful, the most successful songs, it hinges on a good, catchy melody. Totally difficult. There's 12 notes, and there's, X amount of patterns of rhythms, and we've probably used up all the best ones. So that's really difficult. Like I said, a good groove, a good vibe, overall, the sonic aesthetic of it, a good vibe. Obviously, I personally never cared about lyrics. I don't care what people are talking about, there's a few songs I'm like, oh, I kind of relate to that, but I personally don't. But I know the average individual, loads of people will love a song because they relate to the songwriter's content, the lyrical content. They value the lyrical content over the melody, over the song itself. To me, that's crazy because I don't listen to music that way. I listen for the music, not poetry.
But I think that's also because you are a musician. So your natural tendency is to think about the technical musicianship versus the average listener who doesn't know how to play anything. They're like, oh, I can relate to those lyrics,
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just how I was, because I remember as a kid, you don't know what people were talking about. It's like, I want to fight for my right to party. When I was a kid, it's like, I didn't really resonate with those lyrics, but the song was cool. It's like catchy Beastie Boys thing, even from my childhood, it's like, I think I just mainly latched onto the groove and to the melody, more than anything. But like I said, as a producer, I've, grown and realized that lyrics are super important. It's like lyrical content and stuff like that could really help, it can make or break what you're talking about. If you get overly political or religious or not, like it can completely open or close doors, in terms of success. So, I mean, what makes a good song to me is the, good grooves, good melodies, and, some amazing performances are important to me. Average person probably don't really care about the amazing performance aspect, in terms of actually, how the music's executed, as much as I would. But, But yeah, I mean, I think, a little bit of everything. I mean, there's a little bit of magic, honestly, I believe, you're like, there's lots of songs that are singles. And like, how did that become a single at that time? That is just crazy to me. Like that, I think back in Megadeth, in the Rust in Peace record, like they were playing it in like amphitheaters. And there were like 20,000 people coming to see them to play that. Like that's my jam. That's awesome to me. But like how did normal people they had 4 guitar solos in one song, and Dave's voice is irritating to most, I like it, but it's like, but at certain points, like, Hangar 18 was a huge song. It's just bizarre, when you think about things like that. And, so it's a really hard thing to pin down, but I would say, like I said, catchy is definitely, it has to be catchy, I think that's all the songs that have lasted forever. Something about it. You're singing along to it. You're whatever, it's like, it's got something about it that you want to hear it again, and I think that, most people call it a hook or whatever. And that applies even, whether it's classical music, like the classical music that there's tons and tons and tons of classical music, but, you have, your Bach and Mozart and your few, your big names who've written a few pieces that just really stick with you. You hear it and it's like, that is amazing. And that is memorable. Some of the most crazy, prodigious music is almost not memorable at all, from the classical era. You can't listen to it and be like, and hear it again, 2 days later and be like, I don't know if I've heard this before. I think I have, but it's amazing from a musical standpoint, but that still doesn't mean it's good,
Yeah, I guess it just keeps it fresh and interesting when you can find something new about a song every time you listen to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's that too. I think in the prog realm, that's a good. Obviously for pop, you don't want it to be deep. You want it to be on the surface. Here it is. It's super. Every element's super catchy, and you listen to it and you've got it right out of the bait. I think the average listener, they don't want to work to listen to music. I personally like music that it's got some catchy stuff, but you have to listen to it over and over to get it all, and you can get something new out of it. I think the extra layers, the extra production value, things like that really help with the progressive styles of music. I think that's a really positive thing. Like I said, if you're doing progressive music, you don't take the guitar solo out. You add more. You add. But you do make the guitar. You don't just shred the guitar solo nonstop. You need to add some cool melody and hook things in there too. It's a balance. I guess if there's one thing I would say as far as what makes a song good is a good balance of a lot of elements.
Totally agree with that. One area of your productions that I really admire the quality of is your guitar tones. And to me, like, they always sound really tight. They're clean. They're very defined. Do you have any tips for tracking guitar and how to capture great tones and get all of that clarity and definition out of them?
Oh, well, I feel like I still am personally working on guitar tones. But I'm mainly, like I said, this is one of those, we were talking earlier, like how when I first started, I did it a certain way, which was a standard way. I just put the 57 right in the middle of the speaker on a guitar cab, and I recorded the guitar, one mic. Then I got crazy and started buying all these mics, doing all this different miking, and the guitar tones really weren't better. I was like reading all this stuff like, oh, I need to do this XY pattern, or I need to do this room mic technique, or I need to do this, thinking like some of my favorite tones. And then I found out later that my favorite tones were actually recorded the way I recorded it when I first started, the standard way. And I'm like, really? He used a SM57 on a, and that's the best, still the best, and I went back to remix my stuff. And I'm like, the guitar tones are better on this stuff than what I got like, a decade later. Like it was maddening almost. And, but yeah, so, I mean, I would recommend just an SM57 on the cab if you're using a real amp. I think it's essential. The speaker, if you want the just quintessential, like most people think it sounds good type tone, just a cab with a vintage 30, guitar speaker, take an SM57, put it right up on the cone. You can't go wrong. It's not, you're not going to mess up or whatever. And it's all EQ after that, on the backside. Your amp, I think the head is less important than the pickup of the guitars. Obviously, like, I think it's important for guitar tones to use the appropriate pickup for the sound you want. Obviously like an industry standard has always been an EMG, like 81. And a lot of people, they always try to get away from it. But every time I hear a tone, I'm like, that's a great tone. And I found out it's like an EMG. I'm like, man, what? Now they have the Fishman Fluence, which is basically they have their active setting, which is basically a clone of like an EMG type active. So you get the really, people are like, oh, I don't like EMGs. I'm like, dude, you have a Fluence pickup and that's cloned an EMG. So whatever. There's this huge, like, people hate on, like, oh, it's compressed and blah, blah. And of course it's compressed. Like, that's part of what makes it razory sharp and clear. That's what you like about it, anyway. But, so yeah, I mean, as far as that, I mean, but I think, one thing that really helped me is not relying on the amp for the sharpness of the sound. A lot of the old tube amps are kind of loose, especially the classic ones, like a, Marshall JCM 800 or a Mesa dual rectifier. They were, PV5150. Now it's the 6505. But all these were common amps back when I first started. And I always got really mushy tones, or more mushy tones than I wanted to get. I didn't realize the professionals were almost always putting some sort of overdrive in front of the amp. There's another common industry standard thing is take a tube screamer of a sort, like an Ibanez tube screamer, was famous obviously being the old 808 tube screamer, and put it in front of the amp, and it gives an actual little bit of upper mid-range bite that gives you some clarity in the mix. Most people, they'll turn the gain all the way down, so you're actually not really overdriving the sound much at all. It's just the signal that hits the front of the amp is a brighter, more sharp signal, so that totally clears up the tone. Like if you just plug straight into the amp, a lot of times it sounds muddy. A lot of your your plugins and things, and like Kemper, your Kemper patches and things. A lot of these are created like with the overdrive sharpness already on. They make the profile with the tube screamer or overdrive of a sort in the signal chain or whatever, so it sounds sharp, sharper than the amp does naturally. Now, obviously, there's some modern amps and there's some other amps that don't need this sharpening. They're sharper tones by themselves or whatever, but they're more on the rare side, I would say. But most of the time I'm using some sort of overdrive. Misha from Periphery sent us his Horizons devices, his version of a tube screamer. I think it's called the Precision Drive, and that thing's amazing. I've been using it almost exclusively, and it does exactly what it says. It has a unique feature that you can control the attack of the part. So if you want a kind of a sharp rhythmic sound, you just twist of a knob and it sounds sharper. If you want it fat, you can twist the knob and it sounds fat. And you can kind of, I literally, when I'm tracking guitars myself, I literally, each tone gets slightly different, gain structure, as you would say, or tightness, sharpness, relative to what's being played and the need for it in the mix. I usually try to set the gain. Hey, is there room for more gain on this part? Let me turn the gain up. Hey, does it need to be, it's got a lot of notes in it. Can we turn it? It's not something you can do live. You can't sit there and ride your gain and sharpen and for each riff. There's no tech that's going to be able to do that. But it's an idealization for a record, because I'm thinking in terms of producer. I know, especially with this progressive music, there are going to be layers. We're not just bass, guitar, drums like AC/DC or whatever. You can set your tone and forget it. This is going to have keyboards. This is going to have vocals. It's, stacked. So I have consciously try to realize, like, I need the most transparent tone for each riff and each part, and if I,
it can't be high gain all the time.
No. Yeah. I mean, it's like, you really, you want to maximize the clarity for each part, and a lot of times, and at first, especially for me, a lot of times I don't know the music before the client comes in at all. Sometimes people send a demo, but I don't have time to sit and study every aspect of every demo people send. A lot of times they change stuff anyway, so it's kind of a waste of time, but it's all an educated guess at first. Luckily, like I said, with modern days, most people when they're tracking real amps or amp emulators even, they'll track a DI signal as well from the guitar and the bass. I always recommend that if you use if you're using a Kemper and Axe Effects amp emulation or, replication, or if you're using a real amp, always use a DI and split the signal and record the direct signal from the guitar. Because if you make the wrong educated guess, like you think, hey, this tone is going to sound great. Once you get everything in there, then you might realize, man, it's still too much gain or not enough gain even. It sounds weak now. I made a bad decision. So look, if you track a DI signal from the guitar, you can always change the amp, the tone or even the amp. Sometimes different amps you know, like a Mesa's kind of fuzzy and thick. You know, sometimes that tone is great for certain riffs, but then not so great for others. Like the band Cryptodira that I'm working with right now, we ended up, you know, we tracked with a 5150, my Voodoo modded 5150. Everything sounded great, but then some riffs sounded thin, so we reamped everything with a Voodoo modded rectifier, an old school rack mount rectifier. Both of these amps used to belong to Dusty from BT Band, by the way. But so we reamped with everything, and then some of those tones were great, but then the other riffs, it sounded better on the 5150. So we ended up using totally different amps for different riffs. You know, they were EQ matched, so you don't perceive them as being different amps. You know, but the gain structure, like I said, the Mesa had that thick, fuzzy sound, which with those sonic characteristics suited these certain riffs better. Then in the 5150 had this edgy clarity, you know, the more aggressive, attacky sound, but it wasn't as thick, or saturated. So, you know, you just kind of utilize the natural qualities of the amp per part, you know. And you can do this on, you know, with different pedals or even different guitars. You know, some guitar pickups, like I said, EMG is going to be more sharp and punchy than say, like a classic Gibson style, humbucker or something like that. It's going to be a little more thick and round on the the low end and not quite as sharp in the mix. So, but sometimes you can use a different guitar and get a similar type of thing. These are super nuanced things, but I think that's part of what gets clarity in the mix is this attention to detail on the smaller, finer points.
It's interesting to hear you talk about using the pedals. That's a technique that I've definitely heard a lot of people using. It sounds like you're kind of using the pickups and the tube screamer, for example, as like a transient shaper.
Absolutely.
Going into the amp. So you had mentioned not cranking the gain on the tube screamer, and a lot of people think, well, it's an overdrive, so I should be slamming it with some more gain. But in that case, it's really the tone's coming, or the shape is coming from the tone control on those pedals.
Yeah,
right?
It's just something to do with that chip. I guess the 4558 chip and the most famous ones, the TI. It's just something to do with the circuitry. If you turn it, you can have the volume all the way down, set the volume at unity, and have the tone at 12 o'clock. If you just turn it on, there's a upper mid range boost. There's a sharpening effect to the tone, just by default. And that, obviously with the, with Misha's pedal, it doesn't have as much of an up range, like flat. But it does it a little bit, but it's not quite as extreme as the tube screamer. So that one you can actually boost on the tone and things like that, and it has that. That transient shaping process or whatever. A lot of your axe effects, you can go in and actually change, your transient stuff. But yeah, a lot of it has to do with that. It's more of more transient, design work as opposed to, as opposed to really working with distortions and things of that nature. That's
And do you find that technique is better suited for arpeggiated music, or does it still apply, in your opinion, to held out chords and more strumming based stuff as well?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's just all it's riff by riff. I mean, it's not even certain types of music or anything like that. Obviously, if most of your riffs are aggressive and thrashy and stuff, EMG is going to be perfect for that. A tube screamer is going to be perfect for that. And it's probably going to work for most of your riffs. But as soon as they go into a different type of riff with some full strums chords, all of a sudden that EMG is maybe smearing some notes together. It might be better to unplug that guitar, get a guitar that has some more note separation, maybe even use a single coil, roll the gain back, maybe not use the tube screamer. If it's the single coil with tube screamer is extra bright, little things like that. It's, all that, experimentation over the years, I kind of know what's going to work in my mixes, just by, I'm like, okay, for this riff, we might need to, hey, can you change your pickup position? Let's split the coil for this. The Contortionists, I work with those guys, and they're really big on, using split coil stuff. A lot of their stuff, a lot of people ask me hey, we want to sound like that. And it's they don't realize they're not using the humbucker hardly whole songs. It's dude, that's, it's a split coil. They tap the coil on their guitars, and it gives it, helps all. They do a lot of arpeggiate, a lot of chorded type stuff that you want every note to come through. And, That's, I think the use of the single coil is essential for that. If we used the humbucker for all the parts, you wouldn't hear, the notes would just smear together, which, like I said, for the thrashy metal stuff, sometimes that's kind of what you want. You want that barrage of sound, punchy type of sound or whatever. So it's just exploiting the natural qualities of different pickups. Like I said, I honestly believe, the amp can affect the sounds, the instance that we used for the Cryptodira, the amp can be a big thing. But first and foremost, I usually go for the pickups use, the guitar use, the pickup use, and, the overdrive use. Like I use use Keeley modified tube screamer. It had what's called the baked mod, he actually came out with a multi-pedal that has, his Keeley tube screamer, his Keeley modified tube screamer, and with a couple of the Keeley overdrives. And you can get a myriad of just different types of saturations and dry overdrive and how you're pushing the front of the amp. And, these types of situations also work with your emulators, with your Kemper and Axe effects, and your plugins as well. How you hit the front end of the plugin. You can get a myriad of different tones even with one plugin. Like I said, to me, I find that the actual, especially with EQ matching, the actual amp used is way less important than the pickups and the overdrive and how you hit the front end of the amp and things like that. I think the speaker is more important than the amp. If you use, some speakers, like I said, just the way they break up or the way they're voiced and things like that, they're going to create not as much work. They're going to create work or, make things more easily. I think that, like I said, for me, I use warehouse guitar speakers has their version of a vintage 30, like the old British vintage 30s to me sound better, less brittle and harsh than the new Chinese made ones. I don't know if they're doing something different, or the materials or workmanship or what, but they sound better. They sound more pleasing to the ear, things like that. And, they're used, especially when they're older, they start mellowing out on the top end, getting more smooth. So what Warehouse Guitar Speakers has done is they've cloned an old Brit worn in speaker, and you can buy one new. And it's really inexpensive, and I found that made a huge difference in my tones and stuff. Just by switching out the speaker, it's a lot more clarity. I get the voicing of a classic old vintage 30 without muddiness, and just it was insane, the difference. More of a difference than swapping out an amp. It's crazy.
So going back to what you said earlier about kind of constantly changing the tone of the guitar sound as you're going through the different riffs, do you track in a way, like, are you just recording riff by riff? Is that your approach there? Or because I know some people have different opinions of, like, sometimes people just play through the whole song. For prog, it's obviously a lot harder to do that. But
yeah, if somebody comes in like, hey, we're a rock and roll band, I've done a few rock and roll bands, and a few just straight up thrash bands, stuff like that, where it's like obviously the consistent just tone works for almost all the riffs, and the consistency is a desired aspect of it, For those styles of bands, just like, hey, let's just rock. A lot of times I'll have the artist, because I want to try to get a performance vibe personally. If they're down for performance sounding record, if they don't want if they come in and like, hey, we want as pristine, precise, clean as possible, then okay, we're tracking it riff by riff. And whoever in the band plays it better, that's who's going to play the part and double it, because we're going to get the best intonation, we're going to get the best tone matching, all this stuff, if you want the absolute best. But if somebody's like, hey, we want a more kind of organic, how we sound live type sound, then I'm okay, let's just play, and then we'll come back. Like I said, if there's any riffs that are like, okay, this tone's not working for this riff, it's kind of muddy, works fine for everything else, then we'll grab a guitar, we'll punch in that spot, that's normally how I would do it. It's like, let's see how it sounds with your sound. Let's capture your sound, record it, and then listen back. And then if there's anything that needs to be touched up, there's some tricks I do in a computer as well to make things work that without them actually re-tracking anything. Like as I mentioned earlier, filtering. Like I said, behind a guitar solo, for instance, I'll bring the volume down and I'll thin out the guitars a little bit. I'll take a little bit of highs away from the rhythm guitars, take away the little bit of lows, and that just gives it some more space for the guitar lead. Of course, a lot of times for guitar leads, I'll use, a different overdrive, a different guitar, a different amp, something, if you've got, for clarity, it's important. I mean, you can't layer the same exact tone over and over and over and expect there to be, note separation or part separation things. At some certain point, there's going to be a brick wall of common frequencies and saturations and things like that. So just by changing the overdrive or changing the pickup, sometimes even going as far as changing the amp or, speaker, you can get clarity and separation and not have to do anything. It just gives you a bigger, wider sound, gives you more depth in terms of the part separation, stuff of that nature.
That's very cool. How about editing? Like, do you rely heavily on editing to make sure everything is tight after the fact, or are you kind of tracking in a way that you can eliminate a lot of that editing up front?
I do a lot of editing. I found that, like I said, it depends. Like I said, there again, if it depends on what the client wants. If the client comes in, they're like, "Hey, we want this to be as pristine, perfect as possible." If they come in, they're like, "Hey, we want to sound like, I don't know, Periphery." Somebody who's like really pretty, gridded out. Things are even subdivisions. Very mechanical, technical sound. So if somebody wants that type of thing, like, okay, let's track this like part by part, even couple bars at a time, make sure everything's clean. If I do it that way, by default, it's easier for people to play more imperfectly in time or whatever. So I don't have to do as much editing. Usually I'll still double check it and touch it up and things like that. But if you're tracking small chunks, then I could just, hey, try it again. And we'll get it perfectly in time type of situation. But a lot of bands, I personally prefer the record to sound like the band. I always say it on the band on their very best day. This is what, if you have an ideal sound guy, the crew and all this stuff, and everybody nails their parts with their ideal equipment, all this stuff, this is what the record's going to sound like. I think that's the best idea. Ultimately, nowadays more than ever, like the product is the live show. That's the only place where you can make money, a decent amount of money. There's not a lot of records to be sold. There's still some money to be had, but so your record is basically an audio business card. It's like, hey, here's what we sound like. Come see us experience this live, I think for success, for people to make a career out of this, that's kind of needs to be their approach. You're not going to make a living just making records and putting out records, might make a little extra money unless you're super lucky and really blow up. And usually that requires a major label of some sort, their resources. But yeah, like, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. But what was your question again?
Just in terms of how much you rely on editing and, if you're tracking to avoid editing later. That kind of thing.
So it would basically like what I like to do, since I think the record should be like kind of a live translation, I try to capture it kind of live-esque. And normally, every once in a while, I'll record somebody where everybody's playing at the same time. I don't really have a large facility. I'm in my basement studio, so I have a vocal booth. The amps, I have some isolation cabs out in the other room, and I have a live room where everybody's, I just have a room where everybody's standing in the same room. So I can track a basic, 4 or 5 piece band or whatever. I can track everybody at one time. And I have done it a few times, and it's great. It's if you got good players, it's really cool because they can vibe off each other, and totally it sounds like a live recording, but with studio separation, So to me, that's the highest integrity type recording. Having said that, usually it's very difficult. You have to have total master players, and there's a level of progressiveness that you can't go beyond, and record that way and expect it to sound clean and great. I think BT Bam maxed out the pinnacle of that with their live recordings. They're, and they do this. They've only done the live recordings after touring or in a tour where they've been playing the stuff night after night, and they're really in shape to play the stuff. But like I said, you can kind of get that vibe if you just, like I said, you let the drummer play from top to bottom. Don't have him punch in part by part. Because what happens is stuff really starts to, you lose the natural human feel. Those slight ramp ups in tempo and dynamic and stuff tend to not be there properly or normally. Same thing with a guitar player or bass player. Sometimes the breakdown hits and they'll hit it harder. If we're tracking part by part, they're not in context. They might play that part too light or something. So I like to let people just play. I would rather have them just play and feel it and put the feeling into what they're playing, into the guitar, to the drums, into the bass. Same thing with vocals. Just go through it, play it, try to put in a good performance, think about what you're saying in the lyrics, put that emotion in, think about, the song, imagine yourself playing in front of 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people, whatever it takes to put that energy, like you want them to feel it. You're feeling it. They're probably going to feel it too. I capture that. Then if things are awry, like, a lot of times with the drums, I almost always do some level of quantizing to get it kind of in the industry spec. People are accustomed now to hearing stuff on time, but like I said, try to do it artfully, where it's like, okay, this is purposely, I'll let the drummer play. Oftentimes I'll have people play, the drummer will lay down his track with everybody playing, no click, just let him do his thing. And then I'll build the click somewhat to what he's doing. I'll kind of smooth some things out, but I'll try to see, okay, he's pushing this part and it sounds good. It's on purpose. Instead of saying, some bands come in like, yeah, this song is at, 150 BPM. And it's like, sometimes that works out great, but then a lot of times, like, I've had bands, they'll come in with their tempos. They think they'll have their tempos worked out. And they're like, man, it just feels so draggy. And it's, and to me, it's like, dude, that sounds draggy. I'm like, just play it, see what it is. I'm like, dude, that song's totally supposed to be 175. And I was like, is this the tempo you guys normally play it? Or does this feel like right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, basically they just determined the tempo wrong, or it just, like I said, just being when everybody's jamming it feels different from what they program the drums to their demos. There's a feel. And I think it's more important that feeling be captured and translated. So, I'll let them come in, just track their stuff. And then I'll do the editing to get it to where it is. Just like with the vocalist, I'm like, I want him to feel what he's saying, to put in the emotion, to concentrate on the stuff that I can't do anything about, which is the emotion, the diction, things like that. I can tune a note. If it's a little sharp, I'm not worried about it. We can throw it in graphic mode of auto tune and bring it down and it'll sound great. It's like, you get, I've noticed, early on, like I said, I would push people to do perfect, and, that causes a couple things. It's like, they start hyper focusing on things like pitch and rhythm. They're not focusing on what they're talking about. They're not focusing on the emotion or the vibe or the groove. They're not focusing on any of that. They start hyper focusing on what you're trying to push them to perfect. And it becomes a sterile, lifeless type sounding part, and it's and I can't do anything about that. There's no like life plug-in where you can you can't.
Wouldn't that be so good?
Yeah, exactly. Somebody needs to work on that. Somebody who can do some programming stuff would be cool. A life injector. But yeah, like with editing, like I said, you can abuse editing. You can really, edit the life out of it. Even if they put the life into it, you can completely edit it out, if you go too far with it. But like I said, with the guitars, like instead of like you're going through, bar at a time and tracking it, or bar at a time and editing every single note, like you can leave some of that natural, like, okay, this riff, I like to go through and like, this riff is really progressive techie. There's 3 different parts going on. The bass player is playing a part, 2 guitar players playing 2 of them. It kind of needs to be, if the timing is too flammy between all the players, it takes away from the riff. I kind of make a decision as to this can kind of stand to be tighter.
That makes sense. Yeah, you're listening to all of the elements at the same time and to see if it needs to be tighter. Yeah. Yeah, because there's so many people that just will quantize every single note, and to your point, that can totally destroy all of that feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel with guitars, like in terms of the editing that you're doing, are you doing a lot of like elastic audio or more slip editing kind of moves? Like what's your approach with that?
More slip editing. Yeah, elastic audio, I feel like it distorts the audio, especially if you have to make some more like even up to a 16th note type move. If somebody's like quite ahead or quite behind, the elastic audio can actually degrade the audio quality. And I think most of the DAWs have something like elastic audio. So I try to avoid elastic audio at all costs. I stretch as a last minute, I would rather copy and paste and crossfade where possible, to keep the sound, the full 24-bit that I record. You start stretching stuff. If you stretch stuff double, then you're down to 12-bit in essence, I don't know exactly how that all works, but I'm pretty sure that's kind of how it works. So, I'd rather not stretch it if at all possible. So normally I'll go to copy and paste before I would do extreme stretching or whatever. Like with drums, with Pro Tools, obviously they have a feature called Beat Detective. It does a fill and crossfade as opposed to elastic audio, like stretching or compressing the audio. It does a copy and paste type algorithm where it picks a portion of the resonance of the note and copies and pastes it so it's 100% sound quality. And I think that's a Pro Tools exclusive thing to my knowledge. I don't think everybody else does the whole stretch and compress thing, which kind of...
I think some of the other programs have something similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. Yeah. Speaking of drums, I know that you work with a lot of material that occasionally has double kicks or blast beats and that kind of stuff. How do you go about approaching the low end in your mixes when you have a consistent element like that throughout a song? Because often those things are just adding this rumble constantly, right? So how do you deal with the low end on those kind of things?
It's just hours and hours of manual editing. Like I said, live, it's like I said, it's idealization. It goes beyond, what you can achieve live. But yeah, if you get in a lot of fast double bass, then you're going to have a barrage of the low sub frequencies that, that can kind of distract in the mix. So, to me, there's it's over a certain, speed, of double bass. I think honestly, if it gets over 90 milliseconds, up to 90 milliseconds is fine. It's separate enough to stay untouched, in my opinion. But once it starts getting faster, the faster it gets, the more you need to reduce the low end. And just the dynamics in general, a lot of drummers trigger, and a lot of metal, it's kind of expected to have kind of triggered kick drums. Because another thing that happens with real acoustic drummers, you play an acoustic kit, the faster you go, the lighter the hits get. Then all of a sudden it doesn't sound aggressive. The notes aren't coming through articulately in the mix. And, it's kind of a traditional thing at this point or whatever for most, extreme metal or whatever, to have a pretty consistent aggressive kick the whole time. So
it's like a machine gun sound.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but to me, it's I don't have a lot of people triggering is cheating, and you play with triggers and see it's, you have to be more articulate, to trigger an acoustic kit. If you're playing sloppy, it's going to miss trigger and really sound bad. So to me, it's just a different type of performance element. So I don't find that sample blending or, sample replacement is 100% cheating. Yes, it is stripping out some of the dynamic elements of the stuff, but in the kick drums instance, a lot of times it's a negative dynamic issue, where things get so fast and you can't hear the drummer's, fast articulate stuff, and it, reduces the aggressiveness of the part and things like that. So, but yeah, if you do use triggers, you have to back down. The faster it goes, the more you have to back down on the sample. It'll just become distracting, annoying in the mix, there has to be some naturalization of that happening in order to, I think there's a key. There's some mixes I've heard, even some top mixers even on the new Killswitch Engage. Andy Sneap's one of my favorite producers. I know he mixed the record. I don't know if it's his fault or not, but any double bass kicks in, it's all the low end was gone. I'm that is weird. That doesn't even sound natural. I don't know whose decision that was. If it was Andy that did that. I mean, haven't heard him do that on other records, but I noticed that when the double bass comes in, there's literally no low end hardly at all on the kick drum. But there's different approaches. Like I said, if you have a boomy type kick sound or a boomy kick sample, you can kind of use a transient designer of a sort or a gate of some sort to kind of tighten up the low end so that the low end is still there the same, but it's just a tighter, shorter low end that keeps that whole build up from happening. So that's a little trick you can use. But yeah, I mean, it's, for me, it's just, I probably spend the most work on, especially with real drums. There's a lot of work that goes into it, dynamically to get things to work right. And especially with real drums, you got a lot of bleed that gets into the snare and the tom tracks and things, just to get all that stuff, clean to where you're not having any negative, cymbal bleed issues, coming into the mix. There's a lot of manual work that goes into that as well. It's the more dynamic the stuff is, the more difficult and more time consuming. It's just part by part, just like I said, with the kick drums, just turn them down. Even if a guy does a little triplet, I'll turn those down just to feed the OCD thing. I know there's a buildup of low end. I want to keep it smooth.
No, that makes sense though, and it kind of ties into what you had mentioned a little while ago about how you'll use automation with your guitar tracks as well to let another instrument kind of stick out in the forefront. So yeah, it makes sense that you would, why not use it on the kick drums as well and carve out that space so that everything else still keeps its low end.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And it's just finding that low end balance of like when you've cut too far.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It is tough. I mean, a lot of these things I'll get everything in the mix or ballpark and I'll just like, is anything a problem? And I'll deal with it. A lot of, because I think some people go too far and too deep into the detail stuff. They do things that are unnecessary. In terms of quantizing, in terms of tuning, in terms of a lot of stuff or whatever, they'll go too far with stuff. They're just automatically like, hey, I do this, this, and this always. And, I used to do that and do all this stuff. And then now that when I get files, like I try to work up a mix. And even when I record bands, I kind of mix as I go, try to get things in the ballpark, see what tones are working. Like that way, if like this tone's probably not going to work, let's go ahead and hit this now. And, it really helps to hear everything, how it's going to be, really helps you make informed decisions on, EQ moves, level moves, tone moves, help you make decisions as to what's best for the project,
For sure. You have to learn from that trial and error.
Yeah. I'm a fan of simplicity. To me, the simpler, the better. Like I said, I'll get people record stuff and I'll get the files. I'm like, dude, there's 6 kick drum tracks. Like, why? Like, it's like, I'll put the 2 normal ones in. If it sounds good, I'll leave it alone. There's like, it's like, I'll maybe bring the others up just to see if it does something. But if it's like, some people just go too crazy. They'll all these layers of guitars, all these, like we recorded the vocals with 4 mics. I'm like, just pick the one that sounds best. Yeah, exactly. Pick the one that sounds the best. And I think a lot of people want to give me options, but a lot of times it's like you're making things take longer than they need to take. Either it sounds good or it doesn't. If you just make that executive decision. If it doesn't sound good, try something else. If it sounds good, then roll. It's like it's just it's not. This. I think some people think you have to have the ultimate sound for everything, and it's like there's never an ultimate sound. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if you think you're like, all right, I've worked tirelessly to get this ultimate guitar sound. Mark my words, you go back and listen to that in 5 years, you're like, that sounds terrible. Like guitar tones that I used to think were amazing. I've gone back and listened to, like, I used to love Pantera's guitar tone. I listen to it now, I'm like, it totally works for what they did, but I'm like, this is a harsh, like shrill, it hurts my ears, like. But when I was a kid, that was like, that's what we wanted. My band's like, we wanted that sound. And now it's a completely undesirable sound for most people. Most people want a big guitar sound.
It was just so different for its time. So it stood out.
Yeah. Like, so we could have, it was amazing for its time. But that's my point, is that a lot of people think they want this ultimate sound and they'll spend so much, even, bands I work with, they want this certain sound. They're like, they won't just let it sound the way it sounds. They're like, dude, the way it sounds great. Sounds good. They're like, no, we want this certain thing, and we'll spend all this time and all this. And, there's bands who have, missed deadlines on records and delayed, for months. And even, I've worked on tweaked mixes for like over a year before the client was finally like, fine. I'm like, dude, this record sounded fine 9 months ago. And it's like, the average listener is not going to notice any of these changes that we've made. And people recording at home, I think that's an important thing. Don't get so, it's like, I can't move forward with working on this song till the snare drum sounds like this. And it's like, dude, it doesn't, it's important. Stuff needs to sound good, but it's not, if the song is good, it's not going to matter if your snare drum is even pretty bad sounding,
Yeah. It's like that saying, what is it? Songs are never finished. They're always abandoned, or something like that. Exactly.
Yeah. Get it. And to me, I've learned to live, it fights against the OCD, because I always, I used to have a specific vision. And when I was a kid, I went through that. I understand the artists, they have something in their head and they want it to be that. But as the older I've gotten, the more I realize that's not as important. And the reality of it is that vision you had that you think is amazing, you will realize that maybe it was as amazing as you thought it was. Or sometimes you realize, like, hey, this was actually, a lot of artists, they write a record and they're like, they think their new album's better, but really their old album's better. And they don't realize it until 10 years later. They're like, dude, our earlier stuff, it's like Metallica, like their earlier stuff was just, I'm sorry, it's just better, to pretty much everybody. Master of Puppets was, I'm sure that every new album they wrote, they were like, this Reload album's amazing, you know. But it's like, you know, it probably is to some people, but the majority of people are like, dude, Master Puppets is way better, you know. It's like, but the fact of the matter is your opinions will change. Like I said, I mean, so, you know, it's kind of like, just get it to where it's like, hey, this is good. I'm stoked. And let's, you know, I've had some clients, you know, they'll mess with stuff so much where we got so far away from the original sounds and original goal and vision that it's actually worse. It would, you know, like, I'm like, dude, it was better before. You know, everything we've done to change the sounds has stripped the life out of it. Just because you heard a new band and you like their tones now and you were stoked on somebody else when you recorded the record 3 months ago, you know, now you're going in a totally different direction. We didn't track it with that in mind. You know, all, you know, it's like that's, it just creates problems. That's what, you know, from being in this so long and being, you know, as old as I am now, whatever, you know, I've seen that it's good to just get it rocking and just move forward, you know, just as long as it doesn't sound bad, you know, just as long as it's off-putting. There's never going to be that ultimate sound, like ultimate vocal tone or whatever. Like you're I'm not saying you're absolutely wasting time. It's a good to experiment and try to get better tones, of course, or whatever.
But it's never going to be perfect. And you know, all those people that chase guitar tones and that kind of stuff, it's like, if there was one perfect guitar tone, we would all have it. We wouldn't have different amps. And when you listen to every recording, it's always a different tone. Like, there's always a difference. And so you're just going to find what works for you and what works for the song in the moment and enjoy it.
Yeah, if anything, focus on the experimentation. Focus on finding unique sounds, finding unique vibes, things of that nature. Don't focus on this one exact sound that's in your head. Like, just find it, you know, find something, you know, and maybe, because usually what's in your head is something you've heard before and you will hunt it for yourself, you know, and it's just not going to get you anywhere. I think in the long run, you know, it's like, you know, a lot of, if you sound exactly like your three favorite bands or whatever, it's like their fans might kind of be like, that's cool. But a lot of their fans would be like, oh, they're ripping these guys off. And that's not good either, you know? So, you know, it's you know, you might get a few of the people who are like looking for more of what their favorite bands are. And you might get a few of those guys. But I mean, ultimately, like, you know, like Slayer doesn't sound like Pantera and Metallica and, you know, all the old school bands, they all had similar qualities. They all had punchy, aggressive metal sound, but they all had a different enough sound. You hear their guitar tone, you're like, that's Slayer. You hear the drum sound, you're like, that's Pantera. You hear, you know, whatever. To me, I think that's what made these bands stand out and what made them all the amphitheater sized bands they were, you know. And it's, you know, if you hear a band, a lot of the new bands coming out, like I have no idea who, you know, sometimes maybe you can tell the vocalist, but then like that guitar sounds exactly like the same plug-in that 20 other, you know, and it drum sounds. I'm like, oh, that's Steven Slate. And, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, to me, I'm almost like, what is the point in this? It's like, they're never going to sound like that live. I mean, it's just, you know, unless you go and trigger Steven Slate samples and whatever else. And, you know, I don't know. That's
a great spot to end off there. I think you hit the nail on the head there about, you know, just getting the songs done and getting them out. And, you know, think about how many hit songs there are now, and if those people had just hum and hawed about getting the right tone, we might never ever have heard those songs. So, you know, you just got to get them out, right?
Yeah.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. For people who might want to follow you online and learn a little bit more about you and your studio, how can they do that?
Well, there's, you know, my website, jamiekinaudio.com. Should be pretty easy to find. And then I have my, you know, classes and things on Creative Live. I think there's links on my site for all that stuff, whatever. They can check that out. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the main place to check out. I have a
awesome
tone crate. If people use Kemper, they can, if they want to jam some of my actual studio tones, it's in the Tone Crate's Kemper bundle. They flew up here from Texas and we grabbed all the sounds that I've used for BT Bam and Contortionist and all these bands, and just the amps I've had in the studio for years. Very cool.
And lastly, any cool projects that you're currently working on right now that are going to be released sometime soon that you're excited to talk about? That you can talk about?
Yeah, there's some few cool stuff that I can't talk about. BT Bam just recently released the remix of their first album. I mean, I'm proud of that. I'm happy to finally get that. That was recorded live in my parents' basement. But I've got, you know, the band Kayanashi I mentioned to you earlier. They're just finished up their mix on their records, coming out with Sony through Sony Equal Vision, and a band called Cryptodira from New York as well, or from up north as well. I think their record's coming out with, I can't remember the record label off the top of my head right now. It's Good Fight, I believe.
Cool.
But yeah, we just finished up their record, and it's both these bands are amazing at what they do. It's definitely prog stuff, but both have very unique vibe, and I think we were able to realize something special and unique with both releases. That's
amazing. Well, I'm really excited to check those out.
Awesome, man. Well, I definitely appreciate you having me, man.
Well, thank you again for being on there. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, brother.
So that was my interview with Jamie King, and that was a lot of fun to record. He shared so much good stuff in there, and I hope that you can take a lot of the information he gave us and implement this into your own mixes. I think that he did a great job of explaining, his process of producing bands and helping them write for the genre and, getting the right sound to meet the demands of the industry. And I also found it really fascinating to hear his whole process of recording guitars and, using the tube screamer as a tool in your signal chain to clean up the sound and get more attack. It's a really cool approach that I've definitely seen used before, but the way he described it really helped to put into perspective the exact reason for using the tube screamer. And I also thought it was really cool to hear how he uses automation with EQ in the mixes, because that's a really cool technique that a lot of people don't think of. We always think of automation as a tool for volume, but when you use it with EQ, you can really help to create a lot of clarity in your mix and create space for other instruments to shine. So very cool that Jamie was talking about that, and it's definitely something that you're going to want to try in your next mix. So Jamie, thank you once again for being on the podcast. Lots of great information here, and I'd love to have you back on the show anytime. I also want to thank you, the listener, for sticking around to the very end and joining me today. Really appreciate it. And if you found this episode helpful, make sure to go on iTunes and leave a rating and a review. That helps me drastically. It allows me to get in front of more people and allow other people who are maybe curious in the podcast and maybe they're debating whether or not they should listen to it or not. By having a review in there and letting people know what they can expect, it will allow more people to get exposed to the show. And that is what this is all about, helping more people make better music and helping to share the love of music production. So make sure to do that. And also, if this is your first time, or even if it's your 50th time listening to the Master Your Mix podcast, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. And if you haven't got it already, on the website, I've got a free download. It's called the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint. It's a guide to using EQ and compression in your mixes and walks you through all of the settings that you can easily implement into your mixes in terms of what to boost, what to cut, how to dial in your compression settings. And by having this resource here, it allows you to make decisions quickly and not have to go through so much trial and error figuring out what you should do in your mixes. This will definitely help pinpoint exactly where you need to pay attention to and help you make better mixes faster. So once again, make sure to check that out, MasterYourMix.com. That's it for today's episode, guys. Can't wait to talk to you in the next one. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.